in a very contemporary way places like the Arctic and other places that we just simply haven't had the capacity to develop economic activities. And this is one of the results. This is just a very small country, Belgium, in the North Sea. This is the whole North Sea that we're looking at, and that little circle on the bottom is about the area of the EEZ of Belgium, so it's relatively small. But this is the level of activity that's occurring in Belgium. In fact, if you add up the demand for space that is in the Belgian EEZ, you wind up with something like 264% of the area is the demand. So almost 2.5 times the amount available is the amount that's required to meet all of the rights that already exist for everything from fishing to sand and gravel extraction. Now there are at least, and I say two, but there are certainly more than that, but there are at least two ways to manage marine space. One is sort of what we do now, and that's an incremental approach. We tackle problems on a sector-by-sector basis. There's usually not a lot of consideration, and again I'm exaggerating to make a point, but there's usually not a lot of consideration of other uses. There might be in an environmental impact statement, but usually in a planning sense there's not. There's not a lot of consideration in an incremental approach with the effects on nature, particularly cumulative effects. And we simply take decisions on a case-by-case basis rather than looking at a more integrated kind of approach. That is obviously the second. That cuts across economic sectors. It cuts across agency interests, both horizontally as well as vertically among different levels of government. And we allocate uses through an integrated approach by considering the effects not only on other uses but also on nature. So this is basically today's approach. Sort of siloed decision-making on a case-by-case basis within individual sectors. Now I want to just do a little bit on why the oceans need spatial planning, what's the nature of the distribution of things, stuff in the ocean. And the facts are that the oceans are not a homogeneous surface or volume that moves in time, so 4 dimensions. It's a very heterogeneous kind of place. Some areas are certainly more important from an ecological standpoint than others. Things like areas of high biodiversity, spawning areas, nursery areas, etc. Some areas are more important from an economic standpoint. Oil and gas deposits, sand and gravel deposits, areas of sustained winds, fishing grounds. Again, these are not everywhere, they're in particular places. So if we're going to do spatial planning and effective spatial management, we have to be able to understand the nature of how these things are distributed, both economically and ecologically, over space and time in ocean space. Now, how can we use this to implement an ecosystem-based approach? Well, one of the problems is that it's easy to talk about ecosystem-based approaches. And I'm actually in one of the few places I know where an ecosystem-based approach has been used very effectively to manage a terrestrial ecosystem. But frankly, there aren't many good examples of ecosystem-based management in marine spaces or marine areas. And so how can spatial planning be used to actually move us in that direction? This is one definition of an ecosystem-based approach. It's from an organization called COMPAS in the United States. It's the consensus statement of about 200 or 300 scientists. And again, I think you're aware of most of these kinds of characteristics in terms of protection of ecosystem function, etc., ensuring interconnectedness of different subjects like land, air, water, integrating ecological, social, economic kinds of goals and objectives. But equally important, an ecosystem approach is obviously based on an area or a particular place. So spatial planning, again, is the tool that you can, once you define what these ecosystems are, you can actually use to begin to do some analysis of the planning implications of ecosystems. About 5 years ago, I was involved with a group called NCIS, the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis at the University of California at Santa Barbara. It was a group of marine scientists primarily, with a few pragmatic planners involved in that. And we talked for 2 years about ocean zoning. And in fact, at that meeting, we decided that ocean zoning might not be the right term, that we actually should be talking about spatial planning, and I'll explain that in a second. But one of the problems is that we have very poor definitions of what these various terms are, and we use ocean management, integrated ocean management, sea use management, ecosystem-based management, etc. So we decided we would try to define what some of these terms really meant, and this is the result of another meeting that we had soon after the NCIS working group sessions that tried to define what spatial planning is. And I just want to emphasize a couple of points. One is that it's a public process. This is not something that's done in the private sector and then sort of imposed on marine environment. It's a public process of analyzing and allocating. That's a word that's very important to understand, because the result of marine spatial planning is the allocation of marine space to particular uses or to particular objectives like development or protection. So it really is a process that means something in terms of allocating space. And we're allocating space to achieve certain goals and objectives that are specified usually through a political process. We call it marine spatial planning with an emphasis on planning, but I want to make sure everybody understands that it's not just planning. Plans are only as good as their implementation, and implementation requires some kind of monitoring, some kind of evaluation, and some kind of feedback back into the planning process if we're really going to effectively implement adaptive management. Marine spatial planning sounds like a pretty vague term as well, but there are specific outputs that come out of a marine planning process, and they're emphasized in the yellow boxes on this diagram. It's analogous to land use planning. And I certainly recognize that there are different characteristics of the marine environment than there are in terrestrial environments, but they're not that different. And the process that we can use to think about, analyze, and allocate space in the marine environment is not that different. The process itself is not that different from what we use in land use planning. And the two outputs of marine spatial planning that we should be concerned about is the development of a marine spatial plan, hopefully an integrated, comprehensive marine spatial plan, and then figure out ocean zoning as a result of that plan. If you have zoning, maps and regulations for particular areas, then you can issue permits based on the guidance that those kinds of documents provide. Again, this is not different from things that we already do in coastal management or land use management or water resource management. There's nothing unique to the process that we're talking about here. We use a similar kind of step-by-step approach for any of these natural resource issues. Marine spatial planning doesn't cover everything. It covers the spatial aspects of human activities as they occur in any management area. So there are other things that you have to deal with in an integrated plan. Controls of inputs to a particular human activity, or management of processes that take place in any activity, as well as the outputs of activity. But spatial planning deals with the time and spatial measures that you can take to manage these kinds of human activities. Oops, what happened here? Somehow that got a little bit out of whack, but that's the single sector diagram. And I wanted to just make a point about this. Marine spatial planning, again, is not the same as zoning. We already do ocean zoning. There are many, many types of zones, and this is just a short list of the zones that we already use and allocate in ocean space. But the point is that most of these zones are established